He, a millionaire heir, is accused of being out of touch. To prove his worth, he goes undercover as a janitor in his own hotel. She, a humble housekeeper with a captivating sense of humor. Richard, disguised as Rick, the new and clumsy janitor, makes countless mistakes. In one particularly embarrassing moment, he expects Sarah to reprimand him, but instead she bursts out laughing. A genuine, infectious laugh he hasn't heard in years. Richard, initially shocked at being laughed at, feels his pride stung. But seeing the purity of Sarah's laughter and the way she treats him without reverence, the millionaire heir falls in love when she laughed at him. Get ready for a twist where a disguise turns into love, and high society and the past will try to destroy this unexpected union. But the power of true love will prove unbreakable, and a millionaire who laughed for the first time will discover true wealth. Watch this story until the end. You will be amazed by this story. If you like love stories, romance, subscribe to this channel, leave your comment. Every day we post videos like this. Continuing, the sound of the waves crashed gently on Miami Beach, but Richard Sterling barely noticed the stunning view through the glass windows of his 42nd floor office. His dark eyes were fixed on the papers scattered on the mahogany desk, numbers and reports that represented decades of his family's hard work. At 30 years old, Richard had grown up among the gilded corridors of the Sterling hotels, breathing the aroma of luxury and hearing the discreet murmur of illustrious guests since childhood. The company founded by his grandfather had become one of the largest hotel groups in the country, with properties spread from New York to Los Angeles, from Chicago to Dallas. Five-star hotels that welcomed international celebrities, powerful executives, and tourists willing to pay fortunes for an unforgettable experience. Richard knew every detail of the financial statements, mastered market strategies, and spoke fluently with investors in 3 languages. In any board meeting, his sharp intelligence and technical knowledge impressed even the most experienced executives. But today, something weighed on his chest like a stone. The words of his father, Edmund Sterling, still echoed in his mind like an unwelcome echo. You understand numbers, Richard, but you don't understand people. How are you going to run an empire that depends on the work of thousands of employees if you've never gotten your hands dirty alongside them? The conversation had taken place 3 days before, during a tense board meeting. Richard was presenting his expansion plan for the Southwest when one of the directors, clearly influenced by his father, questioned his leadership ability. "The boy is brilliant with spreadsheets," said the gray-haired man, "but has he ever worked a single day on the front lines? Has he ever talked for more than 5 minutes with a housekeeper, with a waiter? How can he understand the needs of our employees if he lives in an ivory tower?" Richard had tried to defend himself, citing his regular visits to the hotels, his employee satisfaction surveys, his international case studies. But the words rang hollow even to himself. The truth was undeniable. He knew the numbers, the strategies, the markets, but he had rarely interacted genuinely with the employees who made the empire work. Edmund Sterling was a fair but demanding man. He had built the business from scratch, starting as a receptionist in a small motel in rural Pennsylvania before opening his first bed and breakfast at 25. He knew every aspect of the business because he had worked in every role. "Son," he said at the end of the meeting, "you have 3 months to prove to me that you can lead real people, not just manage spreadsheets. If you can't, I'm going to reconsider the succession." The threat was not empty. Richard knew his father was serious. Edmund had dedicated his entire life to those hotels, and he wouldn't hand over the command to someone he didn't completely trust. Even as the natural heir, Richard would need to earn the respect not only of his family, but of everyone who doubted his ability to connect with the people who would make his success or failure. For 2 days, Richard had rehashed the conversation, oscillating between anger and self-awareness. Looking at himself in the mirror of his penthouse apartment overlooking Central Park, he recognized that he had become exactly what his father feared, a competent executive, but distant from the reality of those who actually did the hard work. His impeccable suits, his imported cars, his dinners at exclusive restaurants had created a bubble around him. That's when the idea came to him, audacious and frightening at the same time. If his father wanted him to understand the employees, Richard would go further than anyone expected. He wouldn't just make a few perfunctory visits or superficial conversations. He would work side by side with them, literally. The plan was risky, and to many would seem ridiculous. Richard Sterling, with a business degree from Wharton and an MBA from Harvard, heir to a 9-figure fortune, would pose as a common janitor in one of his own hotels. He would choose the Sterling Grand in Las Vegas, the luxury hotel that had been inaugurated 2 years earlier and where he rarely appeared. Nobody would know him personally. For an entire week, Richard planned every detail. He would create a false identity, Rick Smith, a guy from the Midwest who came to Vegas looking for opportunities. He would rent a small apartment in a working-class neighborhood, buy simple clothes, study how to behave, how to talk, how to act. It would be a method of total immersion that would finally give him the perspective he so desperately needed. Resistance came from all sides. His personal assistant thought the idea was insane. His lawyer warned about the legal risks. His friends laughed, thinking it was just another one of the eccentricities of the hotel playboy, as he was sometimes called by social media. But Richard was determined. For the first time in years, he felt he was making a truly courageous decision, not just a smart one. On the eve of starting his new life, Richard was nervous in a way he hadn't experienced since adolescence. He had put away his luxury watches, his silk ties, his Italian shoes. In their place were cheap jeans, simple t-shirts, and worn sneakers bought at a discount store. Looking in the mirror, he barely recognized himself. His father didn't know the details of the plan, only that Richard had decided to spend some time getting to know the practical operations better. Edmund had been intrigued, but supported the initiative. Great, son. That's what I wanted to hear. But remember, you have 3 months to convince me that you can be more than just a brilliant administrator. Richard took a deep breath, adjusted his new identity, and prepared to discover who he really was when stripped of all the privileges that had always defined his life. The next day, Rick Smith would report to work as a janitor at the Sterling Grand, beginning the most challenging experience of his existence. The Sterling Grand awoke to the silent bustle of employees arriving before dawn. Richard parked his borrowed motorcycle in the employee parking lot, his hands trembling slightly, not from the morning chill of Las Vegas, but from the anxiety that was taking over him. He wore a simple navy blue uniform and carried a cheap backpack with his few belongings of Rick Smith. The employee entrance was in the back of the hotel, far from the sumptuous marble reception that he knew so well. It was a parallel world that existed behind the scenes of his own empire, moving with precision to ensure that guests never noticed the hard work behind every comfort. "You must be Rick," said Donna Carmen, the cleaning supervisor, a robust woman in her late 50s with a warm smile, but eyes that missed nothing. "Welcome to the team. I'll introduce you to Sarah. She'll teach you the basics today." Richard nodded, trying to look natural, but his erect posture and the way he observed everything around him betrayed his inexperience. He followed Donna Carmen through the service corridors, passing the industrial laundry, the cleaning supply depots, and the room where employees kept their belongings. That's when he saw her. Sarah Costa was organizing a cleaning cart, humming a popular song softly as she checked if all the products were in the right places. Her brown hair was tied in a practical ponytail, and she wore the same navy blue uniform, but somehow managed to look stylish even in the simple clothes. When she turned to greet him, Richard was struck by the most genuine smile he had seen in years. "Hi, you must be the newbie," said Sarah, extending her hand. "I'm Sarah. Donna Carmen said you've never worked in a hotel before, is that right?" That's right," Richard stammered, shaking her hand and noticing the firmness of her grip. "I'm Rick Smith." "Relax, Rick. Everyone was a newbie one day. I'll teach you everything properly. You'll see it's not that complicated." Sarah's voice had a musical quality, an infectious optimism that seemed to light up the austere corridor. During the first hour, Sarah explained the basic procedures with a patience that surprised Richard. She showed him how to prepare the cleaning products, how to organize the cart for maximum efficiency, how to identify the different types of dirt, and which product to use for each situation. Richard tried to keep up, but his mind, accustomed to complex corporate strategies, became confused with seemingly simple tasks. "We always start with the bathrooms," Sarah explained as she pushed the cart towards the upper floors. "I know it's not the most glamorous part, but it's the most important. A poorly cleaned bathroom can ruin the entire guest experience." Richard nodded, trying to look interested, but his hands were sweating at the thought of cleaning bathrooms. In his entire life, he had never even cleaned his own bathroom at home. He had always had maids to do it. The disaster began in the third room. Sarah had given him the simple task of cleaning the bathroom mirror while she organized the towels. Richard grabbed the cleaning product bottle, but in an attempt to show efficiency, he squeezed too hard. The liquid squirted violently, splashing on his face, the wall, the floor, and even the ceiling. Startled, he stepped back and stepped on his own bucket, which flew into the air, scattering soapy water all over the floor. In a panic, Richard tried to balance himself, but his feet slipped on the soapy water. He grabbed the shower curtain to avoid falling, but the fabric came loose from the rod, enveloping him like a shroud as he slid across the wet floor in a comical sequence of uncoordinated movements. When he finally stopped sliding, he was sitting on the soaked floor with the curtain around his body and soap foam in his hair. The bathroom looked like it had been hit by a cleaning product hurricane. Richard expected screams, reprimands, maybe even immediate dismissal. In his business life, a much smaller mistake could result in severe consequences. He looked at Sarah, preparing himself for the worst. But what happened next changed his life forever. Sarah looked at him, the powerful and feared man in boardrooms, now sitting on the floor like a child who had made mischief, and began to laugh. It wasn't a laugh of scorn or cruelty, but a genuine crystalline laugh that sprang from the depths of her soul like a fountain of pure joy. "Oh my God," she managed to say between laughs. "In 15 years working in hotels, I've never seen anyone manage to make such a mess trying to clean a mirror." Sarah's laughter was contagious, musical, completely free of malice. She was laughing at the situation, not at him, and somehow managed to find beauty in the chaos he had created. It was the laughter of someone who knew how to find lightness, even in the most difficult circumstances, who transformed disasters into reasons for joy. Richard, still sitting on the soaked floor, felt something move inside his chest, something that had been dormant for years. It wasn't just physical attraction, although Sarah was gorgeous when she laughed like that. It was something deeper, more transformative. It was as if, in that moment of complete vulnerability and ridicule, he had seen the true essence of happiness. For years, Richard had been treated with reverence, fear, or self-interest. No one laughed in his presence, except at the jokes he made or the stories he told. But here was a woman who was laughing at him, at his incompetence, at his pathetic situation. And somehow, that was the most beautiful thing he had ever experienced. "Come on, let's get you out of there before you drown in foam," said Sarah, still laughing and reaching out to help him up. "We're going to have to start from scratch, but don't worry. Everyone has a terrible first day." When Richard took her hand to get up, he felt an electric current run through his body. It wasn't just the physical touch, but the genuine kindness, the complete acceptance of his flaws. Her ability to transform his greatest embarrassment into a moment of real human connection. In that instant, the hotel magnate fell head over heels in love with the housekeeper, who laughed at his clumsiness with the purity of a child and the wisdom of a woman who knew the true value of joy. In the weeks following the bathroom disaster, Richard transformed into the most dedicated student Sarah had ever trained. He arrived half an hour early every day, studied the cleaning products as if they were complex financial reports, and took notes in a small notebook he carried in his uniform pocket. "Rick, you don't need to memorize the chemical formula of the detergent," Sarah laughed, watching him carefully read the label of a product for the 5th time. "Just spray and wipe, it's not rocket science." But for Richard, each task had become a personal mission. Not just because he wanted to impress Sarah, although that was a powerful motivation, but because for the first time in his life, he was learning something completely new, something that took him out of his comfort zone in a radical way. Every mirror cleaned without streaks, every bed made to perfection, every sanitized bathroom represented a small victory over his old life of privilege. What surprised him most was discovering the hidden complexity in that work he had always considered simple. There was a science in knowing which product to use on each surface, an art in arranging a room to make it feel welcoming, a strategy in planning the cleaning route to maximize efficiency. Sarah mastered all of this with a naturalness that he admired more and more. "You're improving really fast," she commented one morning while they were making up the presidential suite together, ironically, the same type of accommodation where Richard always stayed when he traveled. "Most newbies take months to get the hang of it, but you seem to have a natural talent for organization." Richard smiled, trying to hide the pride he felt with the compliment. If she knew that he had spent years organizing complex hotel operations, she would understand where this natural aptitude came from. But the truth was that working alongside her was teaching him things that no MBA had covered. During coffee breaks, Richard began to learn more about Sarah's life. She lived in Queens with her mother, Donna Connie, who had raised 3 children alone after her husband abandoned them when Sarah was 15. She had worked in the hotel industry since she was 19, sent money regularly to help pay for her mother's medical treatment, and still managed to maintain an infectious optimism that lit up any environment. "My mom always says that we can choose to be bitter about our problems, or learn to dance in the rain," Sarah said, stirring sugar into her coffee. "I prefer to dance." Richard listened to these stories with growing fascination. Sarah's life was full of challenges that he had never faced, but she transformed them into lessons of gratitude and strength. Compared to that, his own problems, pressures from the board of directors, investment decisions, family disputes over succession, seemed absurdly trivial. Little by little, Richard began to share carefully edited pieces of his own story. He invented a childhood in rural Ohio, talked about an overly strict father and the feeling of never being good enough. The fiction was so close to the emotional reality that sometimes he himself forgot where Rick Smith ended and Richard Sterling began. "You have a different way of speaking," Sarah observed one day while they were having lunch in the employee cafeteria. "It seems like you studied more than most of us." Richard's heart skipped a beat. He had tried so hard to adapt his vocabulary, but small details still gave him away. "I've always liked reading a lot," he said, trying to sound casual. "My mom said that was important." Sarah nodded, seeming to accept the explanation. "I love reading too, especially romances. You know, those where the poor girl falls in love with the rich guy and they live happily ever after. I know it's fantasy, but it's nice to dream sometimes." Richard almost choked on his soda. "And do you believe that could happen in real life?" "Oh, Rick," Sarah laughed in that way that made his heart race. "That kind of thing only exists in books. In real life, everyone stays in their own little world. Rich marries rich, poor marries poor. That's how it works." Her words hit him like a punch in the stomach. Not because of cruelty, Sarah was never cruel, but because of the naturalness with which she accepted this separation of worlds as an immutable fact of life. For her, the idea that someone like Rick Smith could be romantically interested in someone from another social class was as absurd as the possibility of flying. This only intensified Richard's determination. He began to look for small ways to demonstrate his interest, always within the limits of his false identity. He brought extra coffee for her on cold mornings, offered to carry the heaviest equipment, invented excuses to work together in special rooms. The breakthrough came during an emergency situation. An important guest had made a serious complaint about the cleanliness of his room, and Donna Carmen was desperate. The hotel's general manager was on his way for an inspection, and if he found any problems, there would be dismissals. "Sarah, you and Rick are going to have to completely redo Suite 1205, said Donna Carmen, visibly nervous. "You're the best I have." Richard knew that suite better than anyone. It was where he stayed himself when he needed to personally supervise the operations of the Sterling Grand. He knew exactly what a demanding guest would look for and how to solve any problem. Working alongside Sarah, he discreetly guided the cleaning to the points he knew were crucial. He suggested checking the bathroom windows, places we sometimes forget, advised reorganizing the amenities. The guest likes it when everything is perfectly aligned, and even adjusted the air conditioning temperature if you leave it too cold. He'll complain if you leave it too hot too. When they finished, the room was impeccable. Sarah looked around impressed. "Rick, how did you know all these things? You've worked here for less than a month, and you seem to understand better than I do what the guests want." Richard felt his blood run cold. He had been careless, letting his expertise show too much. I observe a lot," he said quickly, "and you're a great teacher." Sarah studied him for a moment, her intelligent eyes searching for something she couldn't name. "There's something different about you. Rick Smith, I can't figure out what it is, but there is." At that moment, watching Sarah try to decipher the mystery he represented, Richard knew he was reaching a dangerous point. Each day that passed, he fell more in love with her, but also dug deeper into the lie that separated them. Soon, he would have to face the consequences of his courageous but potentially disastrous choice. The first big test came on a rainy Thursday, when Richard least expected it. He was helping Sarah organize the cleaning supply closet when Donna Carmen appeared in the doorway with an expression of barely disguised panic. "Sarah, Rick, you two are going to have to do me a huge favor," she said, wringing her hands nervously. "A group of important business executives arrived this morning, and the cleaning staff on the VIP floors called out at the last minute. I need you to cover the 15th floor." Richard felt his blood run cold. The 15th floor was reserved exclusively for ultra-high-profile guests, CEOs of multinational corporations, influential politicians, celebrities who paid fortunes for privacy and discretion. It was exactly the type of environment where he could be recognized. "Donna Carmen, I've never worked on the VIP floors," Richard protested, trying to find an excuse. "Maybe it's better if I stay here organizing the stock." "Nonsense, Rick. You're improving really fast, and I need my best employees up there. Besides, Sarah will be with you the whole time." Sarah looked at him curiously. "Why are you nervous?" "It's just cleaning, like the other floors." Richard had no choice. Insistently refusing would raise even more suspicions. He picked up his cleaning cart with trembling hands and followed Sarah to the service elevator. During the ascent, he tried to calm himself. They were just some businessmen. The chances of running into someone who knew him were minimal. He would keep his head down, do the work quickly, and get out of there without any problems. The 15th floor was a world apart. The corridors were wider, the doors more imposing, and even the air seemed more refined. Richard knew every detail of that environment. He had dined there several times in private meetings. "We'll start with Suite 1501, said Sarah, checking the list. "The guest left for a meeting, so we have free rein." They had been working for about half an hour when Richard heard voices in the hallway, male voices talking animatedly about business. One of them made his heart stop. It was Robert Miller, his partner in 2 ventures and a friend since college. If Robert saw him there, dressed as a janitor, not only would his false identity be destroyed, but the news would reach his father's ears in a matter of hours. "Sarah," Richard whispered desperately, I need to go to the bathroom, urgent." Sarah looked at him worriedly. "You're pale, Rick. Are you feeling sick?" The voices were getting closer. Richard could distinguish Robert's characteristic laugh, that chuckle that echoed through the halls of the country clubs where they frequented together. In absolute panic, Richard did the only thing he could think of. He dived under the king-size bed in the suite, dragging some cleaning products with him in a desperate attempt to hide. "Rick, for God's sake, what are you doing?" Sarah bent down, trying to understand what had happened. The voices reached the door. Richard heard Robert explaining to someone, probably another guest, about the excellent accommodations at the Sterling. Grand, and how Richard Sterling really knew how to run a business. Lying under the bed, like a child hiding from a monster, Richard had never felt so humiliated in his life, not only because of the ridiculous situation, but because of the awareness that he was dragging Sarah into that insane farce. "Rick, get out of there now," Sarah whispered urgently. "If someone comes in here and sees you hiding under the bed, they'll think we're thieves." The voices moved away down the hallway, but Richard remained motionless, paralyzed by the realization of how close he had come to disaster. When he finally came out from under the bed, he was covered in dust, and his uniform was crumpled. Sarah watched him with a mixture of concern and irritation. "What was that, Rick? You scared me. I thought I had forgotten something under the bed," he lied weakly. "What thing? And since when have you been so nervous? You've been acting weird since we got here." Richard tried to brush the dust off his uniform, but his hands were shaking. "It's nothing, Sarah. Let's continue the work." But Sarah was not convinced. For the rest of the morning, she watched him with growing distrust. Richard made a series of nervous mistakes. He knocked over a decorative vase, used the wrong product to clean a marble surface, and even politely addressed a guest who passed by in the hallway, a mistake that no experienced employee would make. The day got worse when they returned to the ground floor. Donna Carmen was waiting for them with a somber expression. "Sarah, I need to talk to you. Management received a complaint about the cleaning on the 15th floor. They say they found products scattered on the floor and that one of the suites was not cleaned properly." Richard felt the world collapse. In his haste to hide, he had knocked over some items from the cleaning cart and hadn't noticed. "That's impossible, Donna Carmen," Sarah protested. "Rick and I did everything right. I checked personally. I know you're careful, but the complaint came from up there. I'm going to have to give you both an official warning." Richard saw Sarah's face pale. An official warning meant that any future mistake could result in dismissal. For someone like her, who supported her family and couldn't afford to lose her job, that was a catastrophe. "Donna Carmen, it was my fault," Richard said quickly. "Sarah did everything right. I was the one who made the mistakes." "Rick, you don't need to defend me," said Sarah, but there was something new in her voice, a coldness that he had never heard before. "If we messed up together." But Richard could see in her eyes a question that haunted him. Why had so many problems started happening after he arrived? That night, alone in his small rented apartment, Richard seriously questioned whether he should continue with that charade. He was putting Sarah at risk, lying to her every day, and building a relationship based on a gigantic lie. Worse still, he was discovering that the more he knew her, the more he loved her, and the more impossible the idea of revealing who he really was became. How could a man who had built his entire identity on privilege and power explain that he had spent months pretending to be a janitor? How could Sarah ever trust him again after discovering the extent of his lie? For the first time since he had begun that journey, Richard seriously considered giving up, going back to his old life, taking control of the company as his father wanted, and trying to forget the woman who had completely changed his perspective on what really mattered in life. The unexpected answer came in the form of old Tony, the longest-serving employee at the Sterling Grand. At 62 years old, he had worked in the hotel's maintenance department for over 20 years and knew every corner, every secret, every story of those walls. He was respected by everyone, from management to the newbies, for his practical wisdom and his ability to solve seemingly impossible problems. Richard found him at the end of a particularly difficult day, sitting alone in the employee break room, drinking coffee and reading an old newspaper. Still tormented by the warning that had cost Sarah and the growing distrust in her eyes, Richard was seriously considering submitting his resignation the next morning. "Can I sit here, old Tony?" Richard asked timidly. The older man examined him for a moment, his experienced eyes seeming to see more than Richard would have liked. "Sure, son. You look like you need a talk." They were silent for a few minutes, Richard nervously stirring his coffee while old Tony continued reading. Finally, the older man folded the newspaper and turned to him. "You're not like the other newbies who have worked here," old Tony said calmly. Richard's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" "I've seen a lot of young men and women come here over the years. Some come because they need the money, others because they have no other option. But you're different. You're too educated to be here, and at the same time, you seem to be learning something that goes far beyond how to clean a room." Richard swallowed hard. "I don't understand." "Yes, you do," old Tony said with a paternal smile. "Look, son, I don't know what your real story is, and I'm not going to ask. Everyone has their reasons for being where they are. But I can tell you one thing. Sarah is wondering who you really are." "Did she say anything?" "She doesn't need to say anything. I've known her since she arrived here, a scared 19-year-old girl trying to support her family. I've seen her grow, become the dedicated professional she is today. And I've never seen her look at anyone the way she looks at you." Richard felt a mixture of hope and panic. "Old Tony, Let me finish," the older man interrupted. "Whoever you are, whatever brought you here, one thing I can see clearly, you care about her, really, and she cares about you too, even if she doesn't completely understand why." Old Tony leaned forward, lowering his voice. "But there's one thing you need to know. Sarah has been through a lot of suffering in her life. Her father abandoned her when she was a teenager. She's had her heart broken by a guy who promised her the world and then disappeared when he found out she didn't have any money to lend him. She's built high walls around her heart, and if you're managing to break them down, it's because there's something very special happening here." Richard absorbed these words like a thirsty man absorbs water. "What are you trying to tell me?" "I'm saying that if you're here for some temporary reason, if you plan to disappear from her life when you get what you came for, it's better to stop now. But if your feelings are true, if you really care about her, then you need to find a way to be honest. Not necessarily now, but eventually. Because lies have short legs, and when the truth comes out, and it always does, it will be better if it comes from your mouth." At that moment, as if summoned by the conversation, Sarah appeared at the entrance to the break room. She hesitated when she saw them talking, but old Tony waved for her to come closer. "Sarah, you arrived at the right time. I was just telling Rick about that time you saved the hotel from a terrible crisis." Sarah blushed. "Oh, old Tony, it was nothing." "Yes, it was," he insisted, winking discreetly at Richard. "Tell him about the Japanese executives." Reluctantly, Sarah sat down and began to tell a story that Richard had never heard in any official report. 2 years earlier, a group of Japanese investors had stayed at the hotel during crucial negotiations to expand the Sterling chain to Asia. On the last night, a failure in the air conditioning system had left the entire VIP wing without refrigeration during unbearable heat. "The manager was desperate," Sarah said. "The guests were furious, threatening to cancel the negotiations and sue the hotel. But I remembered that my grandmother always said that the night wind from the sea is more refreshing than any air conditioning." Richard listened, fascinated, as Sarah had convinced management to organize a special supper on the hotel rooftop, outdoors overlooking the ocean. She personally had helped rearrange the entire event, working all night to transform what could have been a disaster into a unique and memorable cultural experience. The Japanese were so impressed with the creativity and personalized service that they not only kept the deal, but increased the investment, concluded old Tony. And it all started with the idea of Sarah here. Richard was shocked. He knew about the success of the negotiations with the Japanese investors. It had been a milestone in the company's international expansion. But in the official reports, the success had been attributed to the operational excellence of management and the superior infrastructure of the Sterling Grand. Sarah's name had never been mentioned. "You never got credit for this?" Richard asked, his indignation being barely contained. Sarah shrugged. "It wasn't my job to get credit. It was my job to help solve the problem. But it's not fair. You saved a multi-million-dollar deal and nobody knew." "Rick, you're too excited," Sarah observed, intrigued by his reaction. "How do you know the deal was worth millions?" Richard realized too late that he had revealed knowledge that Rick Smith should never have had. Old Tony watched him with a subtle smile, as if he had just confirmed something he already suspected. I read about it in the newspaper at the time," Richard lied quickly. "It said it was a major international expansion." Sarah studied him for a long moment. "You have a very good memory for old newspaper details, Rick Smith." At that instant, Richard understood that his situation had reached a critical point. Old Tony was right. The truth would eventually come out. The question was whether he would have the courage to control it before it completely destroyed him. But looking at Sarah, seeing the intelligence in her eyes, the strength in her posture, the dignity she carried despite never having received the recognition she deserved, Richard knew he couldn't give up. Not yet. She deserved more than she had received from life. And if there was one thing that his position and resources could do, it would be to ensure that the world knew the real value of Sarah Costa. Disaster struck on a grey Monday, when Richard believed he was finally managing to balance his double life. He had spent the weekend planning subtle ways to help Sarah receive the recognition she deserved when everything collapsed at once. The morning began with Donna Carmen calling Sarah in for a private conversation. Richard noticed the tension on the supervisor's face and Sarah's growing nervousness when she returned, visibly shaken. "What happened?" Richard asked. But Sarah just shook her head, saying she preferred not to talk about it. The answer came 2 hours later, when the hotel's general manager, Mr. Caldwell, appeared in person on the 11th floor where they worked. He was a man Richard knew well from executive meetings, although they had never spoken directly. "Sarah Costa?" said Mr. Caldwell with a coldness that made Richard cringe. "Yes, sir," replied Sarah, straightening her shoulders with the dignity that Richard so admired. "I need you to come with me. There's a serious accusation against you." Richard felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. "What kind of accusation?" Mr. Caldwell didn't even bother to look at him. "That's none of your business, employee." But Sarah turned to Richard, and he could see the fear in her eyes. "Rick, meet me at the employee exit at 6, please. I need to talk to you." The next 8 hours were the longest of Richard's life. He tried to work, but he couldn't concentrate. He discreetly asked other employees, but no one knew exactly what was happening, only that Sarah had been taken to the administration for an interrogation. When he finally found her at the employee exit, Sarah was visibly shaken. Her eyes were red, as if she had been crying, but she kept her head up. "Sarah, what happened?" Richard asked, taking her hands in his. "Someone accused me of stealing jewelry from a guest," she said in a trembling voice. "A diamond bracelet that's worth more than I would earn in 10 years of work." Richard felt like he had been punched in the stomach. "That's absurd. Anyone who knows you would never do such a thing. The guest says that only you and I were in the room yesterday morning. The jewelry disappeared after our cleaning." Sarah looked directly into his eyes. "Rick, did you take anything from that room?" The question hit Richard like a slap in the face, not because of the accusation. He knew Sarah needed to ask, but because of the realization that his presence had put her in that situation. If he hadn't been there, if he hadn't insisted on working in that specific room because he knew the guest's habits, Sarah would never have been suspected. "Of course not, Sarah. You know I would never do that." "I know," she said quickly. "Sorry for asking. It's just that, Rick, they gave me 2 weeks of suspension without pay while they investigate. If they don't find the jewelry, I'll be fired, and I can still be criminally liable." Richard felt the world spin around him. 2 weeks without pay for Sarah meant that she would not be able to pay the rent or her mother's medicine. A dismissal for cause would prevent her from getting another job in the hotel industry. And if the accusation resulted in criminal proceedings, her life would be ruined. "There has to be something we can do," Richard said desperately. "Security cameras, other employees who were on the floor. They've already checked everything. The hallway cameras only show you and me entering and leaving the room. No one else had access." Sarah took a deep breath, trying to maintain her composure. "The worst part is that I need this job, Rick. My mom is counting on me. I don't know what I'm going to do." At that moment, Richard knew exactly what he could do to solve everything. A simple call to his father, a 5-minute conversation with Mr. Caldwell, and the entire investigation would disappear. Sarah would be not only exonerated, but probably promoted. The guest would be discreetly convinced to find her jewelry elsewhere. But doing so would mean revealing his true identity. It would mean admitting that he had spent months lying to her, pretending to be someone he wasn't, building a relationship based on a gigantic lie. "Sarah," he said slowly, What if I could help? What if I knew someone who could solve this?" She looked at him curiously. "What do you mean? Who do you know that would have that kind of influence?" Richard opened his mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come out. How to explain without revealing everything? How to save her without completely destroying the trust they had built together? "Rick, you're scaring me. What aren't you telling me?" They were standing in the fine rain that was starting to fall, and Richard saw in Sarah's eyes a mixture of hope and fear. Hope that he might have a solution, fear of discovering who he really was. I can't explain now," he said finally, "but I promise I'll find a way to prove your innocence." "How, Rick? How are you going to do that?" Her voice was getting louder, more desperate. "You're a janitor like me. What influence could you have with the hotel management?" The question echoed in the rainy air like an accusation. Richard realized that he had reached the point where any movement would be catastrophic. If he revealed the truth, he would lose Sarah forever. If he did nothing, she would be destroyed by a false accusation. And the worst part was knowing that if he was just Rick Smith, there really would be nothing he could do. The social injustice that Sarah faced, being immediately suspected, having no resources to defend herself, depending on the goodwill of employers who didn't care about individual employees, was a brutal reality that he had never fully understood until that moment. Looking at Sarah trembling in the rain, Richard faced the most painful truth of his life. In trying to know her world, he had become responsible for putting her in the worst situation she had ever faced. And now he needed to decide if he was willing to sacrifice his own carefully constructed lie to save the woman he loved more than his own life. Richard spent the night sleepless, pacing the small apartment like a caged animal. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Sarah's face destroyed by injustice, saw the tears she had tried to hide, heard the despair in her voice when she had asked how a simple janitor could help her. At 4 a.m, he made the most difficult decision of his life. He could no longer live in the lie, not when that lie was costing the dignity of the woman he loved. Sarah deserved the truth, deserved justice, and deserved someone willing to fight for her without hiding behind disguises and false identities. Richard called old Tony at 5 a.m, knowing that the older man woke up early. "Old Tony, I need your help," he said bluntly. "About Sarah, about the accusations. I know you suspect who I really am." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "I was waiting for this call, son, so you know. I know you're not who you say you are. And I know you care about Sarah more than any man has ever cared. The rest, well, you're going to have to tell me." Richard took a deep breath. "I need you to meet me at the hotel in an hour, and I need you to trust me, regardless of what you discover about me. I already trust you, Rick, or whatever your real name is." An hour later, Richard was in the parking lot of the Sterling Grand, no longer dressed in the navy blue janitor's uniform, but in an impeccable suit that he had picked up from his original apartment. His hair was combed, his hands clean of the calluses he had developed in recent months. He looked again like the powerful executive he had always been, but with something different in his eyes, a determination that came from the heart, not just from ambition. Old Tony was waiting for him near the employee entrance, and when he saw Richard, his eyes widened slightly. "My God," murmured the older man. "You're Richard Sterling," confirmed Richard. "Heir and future CEO of Sterling Hotels. And I'm in love with the woman you're trying to destroy with false accusations." Old Tony shook his head, partly impressed, partly amused. "I knew you were different, but this is a surprise even for me. Old Tony, I need to save Sarah, but when I do that, she's going to find out that I've spent months lying to her. She's going to find out that our entire friendship, everything we've built together, was based on a lie." "Was it really?" asked Old Tony calmly. "Were the feelings a lie?" "The affection, the respect, the way you treat her. Was all that fake?" "No! That's the only thing that's true in this whole situation. Then maybe that's what matters." Richard spent the next 2 hours in the hotel office, gathering information that only someone with his level of access could obtain. He checked the security cameras personally, analyzed employee records, investigated the history of the guest who had made the accusation. And what he discovered confirmed his suspicions. The woman had a pattern of making similar accusations in other hotels, always targeting vulnerable employees, always resulting in discreet financial settlements. But Richard knew that this information alone would not be enough. He needed more. He needed irrefutable proof, and he needed to do it all before Sarah suffered more humiliation. During the day, he watched from afar as she arrived to try to negotiate with the administration. Even suspended, Sarah had come to the hotel to try to prove her innocence on her own. Richard saw her talking to other employees, looking for witnesses, fighting with all her strength to clear her name. The sight of her determination only intensified Richard's resolve. She was fighting alone against a system that had disadvantaged her from the start, using only her integrity and her courage as weapons against powerful accusers who could destroy her life with a lie. In the late afternoon, Richard discovered the final piece of the puzzle. The stolen jewelry had been sold by the guest herself 3 days before the theft. He found the transaction receipt in her credit card records, information that he managed to access through his contacts in the financial sector. It was the proof he needed, but using that information would mean revealing resources and influence that Rick Smith could never have. While planning his next move, Richard received a call that changed everything. "Rick," it was Sarah's voice, clearly in panic. "Can you come to the hotel now? They called the police. They say they have new evidence against me." Richard felt his blood run cold. "What kind of evidence?" "They don't know, but they're saying they found the jewelry in my locker here at the hotel." "Rick, someone put it there. I swear I didn't take anything." Richard immediately understood what was happening. The guest, realizing that her fraud could be discovered, had planted false jewelry to solidify her accusation. It was a desperate but effective move. "Sarah, where are you now?" "In the administration. They're waiting for the police to arrive." "Rick, I'm very scared. If they arrest me, they're not going to arrest you," Richard said with ironclad conviction. "I promise they won't." When he hung up the phone, Richard knew that the moment of absolute truth had arrived. There was no more time for careful plans or gradual revelations. Sarah was minutes away from being arrested for a crime she didn't commit, and only Richard Sterling, not Rick Smith, had the power to stop it. He looked at himself in the mirror of the executive bathroom, adjusted his tie, and prepared for the confrontation that would define not only Sarah's future, but the destiny of both of them. It was time to stop hiding and fight for the woman who had taught him the true meaning of love. Richard Sterling walked through the doors of the Sterling Grand no longer as the janitor Rick Smith, but as the heir to the hotel empire he would one day command. His steps echoed with authority through the marble corridors as he headed directly to the administration office, where he knew Sarah was being humiliated by an accusation that he had the power to destroy. The room was full when he entered. Mr. Caldwell, Donna Carmen, 2 police officers. The accusing guest, an elegant middle-aged woman with an air of superiority, and Sarah sitting in a chair in the center as if she were being judged by a court. The silence was instantaneous. Mr. Caldwell stood up abruptly, clearly shocked by the unexpected presence of the future owner of the hotel. "Mr. Sterling, we weren't expecting... nobody informed us that you would be here today." Sarah looked at Richard with absolute confusion. She saw a man in an impeccable suit, with the confident posture of someone who was used to commanding, but there was something familiar in those eyes, in that nervous smile. "Rick," she whispered, incredulous. Richard turned to her, and at that moment all his corporate mask disappeared. He was just a man in love, looking at the woman who had changed his life forever. "Hi, Sarah," he said softly. "I'm so sorry I didn't tell you the truth before." The room exploded in confused murmurs. Donna Carmen seemed about to faint. The police officers exchanged glances, without understanding what was happening. You're Richard Sterling?" Sarah asked, her voice mixing shock and a deep pain. "The owner of the hotel?" "Future owner," corrected Richard, without taking his eyes off her. "And yes, I lied about who I was. But I never lied about my feelings for you." The accusing guest tried to intervene. "With all due respect, Mr. Sterling, but that doesn't change the fact that your employees..." "Mrs. Beatrice Almeida," interrupted Richard, his voice now laden with glacial authority. "Or would you prefer that I use your real name, Beatrice Santos, who has already applied this same scam in hotels in New York, Chicago, and Dallas?" The woman paled instantly. Richard addressed the police officers. "Officers, I have here the receipts proving that this woman sold the stolen jewelry 3 days before making the report." He handed over a folder with documents. "We also have records that she has a pattern of fraudulent behavior in luxury establishments." That's impossible," stammered the woman. Impossible would be an employee with 5 years of a clean record suddenly deciding to steal precisely in the week that you arrived at the hotel, replied Richard coldly. "The jewelry you found in Sarah's locker is fake. I can prove it with the purchase receipts you made yesterday in a cheap jewelry store." The police officers examined the documents while the woman tried to protest, but her lies collapsed one by one before the irrefutable evidence that only someone with Richard's resources could have gathered so quickly. "Ma'am, you're going to have to come with us," said one of the officers, addressing the fraudster. As the false victim was led out of the room, Richard turned to face Sarah. She was standing now, trembling not with fear, but with a complex mixture of relief, anger, and pain. "You lied to me for months," she said, her voice low but charged with emotion. "You made me fall in love with someone who didn't exist." "Sarah, no!" she exploded. "You saw me clean bathrooms. You saw me embarrass myself. You saw me tell you my most intimate problems, thinking I was talking to an equal. And all the time you were this." She gestured to his suit, his posture, everything that represented the social abyss between them. Richard took a step towards her. "I was, and I still am, the man who hid under the bed because he was dying of fear of you finding out who I was. I'm the man who learned from you that there is beauty in simplicity, that there is dignity in honest work, that there is a type of wealth that cannot be bought." "Pretty words," said Sarah, tears rolling down her face. "But how can I trust you? How can I believe anything you say after such a big lie?" Richard knelt before her right there, in front of all the employees, in front of his future subordinate, in front of anyone who wanted to see. The proud heir of the Sterling hotels knelt before a housekeeper because he knew it was the only gesture that could express the truth of his feelings. "Sarah Costa," he said, his voice trembling with emotion, "I can't undo the lie. I can't go back in time and be honest from day one. But I can promise you that from now on, there will never be secrets between us again. I fell in love with you when you laughed at my clumsiness, and since then every day by your side has taught me something about being a better man." He took her hands in his. "You saved this hotel with your creativity and never received credit. You work harder than any executive I know and earn a fraction of what you deserve. You have more wisdom, more courage, and more love in your heart than anyone I have ever met. And if you give me a chance, I want to spend the rest of my life making sure that the whole world knows how much you're worth." The silence in the room was absolute. Sarah looked down, seeing the powerful man kneeling at her feet, vulnerable and completely surrendered. Richard," she said finally, "you hurt me. The lie hurt me more than I can explain." "I know," he whispered, "and I'm going to spend the rest of my life making up for it if you let me." Sarah took a deep breath, and when she spoke again, there was a new strength in her voice. "If we're going to try this, it's going to be on my terms. I'm not going to be your adventure with the woman of the people. I'm not going to be a trophy that proves you've learned to be humble. If you want me for real, as an equal." Richard smiled through the tears he hadn't even realized were falling. "Sarah, you're not my equal. You are infinitely superior to me." And then she did something that no one expected. Sarah started to laugh. The same crystalline laugh that had conquered Richard months before. The laugh that transformed any difficult moment into something beautiful. "You're still kind of clumsy, you know," she said, helping him to get up. "But this time, at least, you stumbled in the right direction." When Richard kissed her, right there in the administration office, in front of everyone, it was as if the whole world made sense for the first time. It was the kiss of a man who had learned that true love knows no social boundaries, of a woman who had discovered that sometimes Prince Charming comes disguised as a clumsy janitor. 6 months later, Sarah Costa Sterling, now Director of Customer Experience for Sterling Hotels, laughed as she told her children the story of how Daddy had hidden under a bed the day they met. And Richard, seeing that laugh that had changed his life forever, knew he had found the true wealth he was looking for. Because sometimes the truest love is born not from a perfect first encounter, but from a second chance to be honest about who we really are. Dear listeners, we hope that the story of Richard and Sarah has touched your hearts as much as it moved us to tell it. To continue this journey of stories that celebrate the transformative power of true love, we have prepared a special selection of equally captivating narratives that you can find by clicking here on the side. If this story has made you believe that love can overcome any barrier, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and leave a like. Every day we bring stories that explore the beauty of human life in all its complexity. Don't miss our next content and tell us in the comments, do you believe that love can really transcend social differences? We'll see you in the next story.